Welcome to everybody who came out on this rainy morning. I'm Marianne Nathan with the Conservation Commission. So I'm going to turn the program over this morning to Jamie. He's going to start it. Jamie?
Morning, everybody. Thanks for coming out on this rainy morning. My name is Jamie Harpswell with the Conservation Commission, and I'm really excited to invite you all here to learn about the power of plants this morning. So this is the third lecture that we have done in our WaterWise series since last fall, building on a lot of the really amazing foundational work that the Conservation Commission has been doing for years on this subject. But in September, we had guest speaker Jessica Meeks from Maine Geological Survey give a lecture here talking about the bedrock condition in town, the fractured bedrock aquifer that we have, and kind of demystify where we get our water from in town, talking about how different water sources are available in different parts of the town based off of different geology. We then built upon that in an October 30th lecture where we talked about how we can be water wiser and how we can focus more on preserving Harpswell's water supply, what we can do in our own homes with our dishwashers, with our toilets and things like that. And so I am very excited to announce Gavin Boyce-Ratliff, landscape designer out of Brunswick, here today.
So I'm sort of wedged between two great talks, practical side of things, tree side of things. I'm really more the middle ground of how this plays into the garden and how we're doing this at home and with herbaceous plants and the smaller scale of how gardens can impact what we're doing to help wildlife and combat climate change, and water usage is a big topic with these talks, so it's a big part of this. Just to quickly introduce myself, I'm from away, I'm in Brunswick, so apologies in advance. But do a lot of work over here. I live over in Pennellville, so I look at Harpswell every morning and happy to be here. I run a design practice that's sort of full-scale landscape design, but the focus is really on naturalistic, I'll say native, but naturalistic plant communities and the plant design piece of garden design. And so there's a lot that's great in our gardens. There's a lot that we like. There's a lot that does well. There's a lot that we can continue to learn from. And there's also a lot that hasn't been working. And we see that visually. We see that when it comes to the insects and animals that want to interact in these spaces with us. And then we see that with all of the climate issues too, which we're talking about. And so what this looks like, some of the things that I think are issues and are symptoms of the gardens that we've created forever and that have been sort of the traditional, are things like putting too much mulch in the garden, using too many chemicals, too many fertilizers, herbicides, pesticides. And I think a big part of it too is that we're creating these spaces that are really intended to be visual as opposed to interactive and engaging, and so we've lost this connection to our landscape. We're designing them in a way that we're putting props out, and it's providing barrier, it's providing visual interest, but it's not something that we necessarily know and love and can engage with on a regular basis. And so these are all things that are causing us to have to rethink what we're doing, and it's some of it is because we're having a shift in what we think looks good and what we want in our gardens, but a lot of it is not up to us. It's what's happening on a level that we have no control over anymore. And so we're getting too much water, and then a week later we're getting not enough water. We are having too much chemical runoff because of it, and so we're causing this inadvertent harm to other landscapes that aren't actually ours, and it's something that we are still at fault for if we're putting this into our landscape. And then another piece to this, which we'll talk about, is the spread of invasives and the fact that things are getting warmer, things are getting wetter, things are getting riper for these advantageous competitive plants. And so right now we're at this threshold, and I'm sure we've all talked about this, where we have all these great native plants that are very used to something that we've had forever. As we warm, the maples and the birches and the beeches are starting to get diseases and pests and all of these issues that they're now not able to compete as well with these invasive plants that are coming in. And so we're at this cross in our society and in our gardens where we have to decide, do we just keep planting as normal and saying we're going to keep doing the same thing over and over again because it's what we've always done, or do we start to think about what else can we add into our gardens, knowing that we're starting to lose the fight with some of these bad plants? So these are all reasons why we have to rethink what we're doing. And so I use the word native at the beginning, and I'm going to back up and say that that's not, I'm not coming into this saying native only, and that's a nuanced conversation we can have another time, but I go with the term naturalistic. And so really it's about taking real life native ecosystems and emulating. So it's not so much necessarily about taking exact things and replicating in our garden, but saying what works well, how can we recreate that in a garden setting. And so we may be really taking a native natural plant community and bringing it in, and it may just be more of a feeling that we're bringing in. So I say that to mention that naturalistic isn't always 100% native. It's certainly not bad invasive, but sometimes there's a place for the non-New England natives, and we'll get into that. So naturalistic falls on this spectrum. There's sort of the heavily ecological, and that can be restoration work, reseeding areas, restoring areas to more natural native habitat. And it's much more scientific in its approach. Ornamental on the other end of the spectrum is really traditional, think of a cottage garden, think of a boxwood-lined landscape. And we're somewhere in the middle of those two things, where it's really trying to take cues from the ecology and from the ecosystems that we share our space with, and then also trying to make it a space that we really want to be in, and a space that engages us and inspires us and feels like a garden. Because that's still, a garden, at the end of the day, as much as we want to make this, or we need to make this a space for all of the creatures we share it with, it's still a space for us, and so it needs to be something that we can fall in love with. Let's see if the clicker keeps going. So here's sort of a visual take on one side of that spectrum. So ecological, there are lots of natural settings that we don't touch that are beautiful. They're wide open meadows and forests and grasslands that on their own are great, beautiful spaces, and we may or may not have to manage them. But it's certainly much more, it's ecological in the sense that things are self-seeding where they want. They've developed here over millennia. Management may not come from us, it may be from grazing animals, it may be from fire, it may be from whatever it is, but really isn't taken with traditional garden management as one of the cues. And so naturalistic is something that still feels very natural to us. It gives us a feeling of those meadows or prairies or woodlands, but it's a set of plant communities that are entirely contrived. It's things that we are imposing on the landscape. Many of them native, we're trying to put in the right things for the space, but if you look at the photo on the right, it's much more of this exaggerated nature where you do large drifts of things, it's exaggerating a meadow or a prairie, wherever it is, and gives you that feeling still, but you can tell the difference when you really are starting to take apart a system and put our own spin on it. On the other end of the spectrum, a naturalistic garden might have a lot of ornamental plants, in quotes, but it's not the same thing as an annual cutting garden or a classic, Versailles, Chatsworth, whatever. We're going very much on the other end of the spectrum, but we can still implement and use a lot of those plants that you would expect in a more traditional garden setting. So we're somewhere again on that spectrum there, and again, I think we're a lot closer to the ecological than we are to the traditional, despite where it sits on that scale, but this is sort of how you can imagine us playing on here. And so again, it's that idea of emulating or exaggerating. It's not imitating, inch for inch, this plant goes here, this is what it would have been like in the grassland behind my house, but it's trying to give the feeling of that nature. So just to back up and get more practical here, why? It's about cutting down on management. I'm sure everyone in here knows this, and I say it every time, there's no such thing as a maintenance-free garden. It's a myth, right? Unless you pave your garden, even that has maintenance, you're gonna be pulling weeds out of the cracks and whatever. So that's not a thing. But even compared to any other more traditional garden, naturalistic with its dense planting and its more native tendencies and stronger root systems in plant communities typically will require less hands-on management. It's spring, we're cutting it back, being in as much as you want, but it's not the traditional input of amendments and deadheading and pruning and all of these things that we're so used to doing. It can support a lot more wildlife than traditional, and again, this is about the density, which we'll talk about. So native or not, having all of the ground covered, if we don't have all this bare mulch and exposed soil and sprays everywhere, we're creating habitat and wildlife for certain pollinators, but density is incredibly important, even compared to what species, but just having density. So it's sort of the mission statement, I would say, and this letters morphed together there, but the idea is to create something that's both ecologically considerate and inviting. And so we're doing our part as best we can for what's beyond our fence, but it also has to be something that we really want to spend time in. So what are some of the hurdles here? Forever, this isn't a new thing, we've had this idea, and more people are really into the idea of supporting wildlife. And that's a very broad term. We say wildlife in quotes. It's vague. There's a lot out there that we can support, and some things that we don't even know how to support yet, right? But at the same time, there's this stigma sometimes around the visual side of this. And so how do we convince neighbors or even ourselves to do this while not feeling like we're providing this visual cue that we are letting a space go, or it's too messy or unkempt? And so a couple of the things to consider, and I think some ways to combat this, you can have the craziest, wildest meadow, whatever plant community you want to describe, and it could actually be unkempt and messy. But if you just give these what I call cues to care, or intentional delineations of space, so between lawn and planting, between driveway and planting, whatever it is, just these, something as simple as an edge. It could be any material, it could be anything, but it just gives this feeling that you are taking care of the space and it is being tended, even if the goal is to let it go and not touch it and let it just go rogue. That's fine, but it's much more forgiving, and people have an easier time getting on board with it when it feels like it's being maintained or controlled on the edges. That's just sort of our innate human experience. Coherence is another big one. This is part of that idea of emulating versus, actually trying to do something copy plant for plant. Where if we can have repeating drifts of color, or we can have something that feels legible from one side of the bed to the other, it really helps people come around to these styles, as opposed to something that really just feels illegible and like they can't understand it. Even if it's ecologically functioning and is a great space, the human piece to that is that if we feel like we can understand what we're looking at, people are much more on board. As Jamie talked about, another piece to that is, be aware of where we are, and there are certain plants, native or not, that are maybe great for a certain garden, for a certain planting, but they may or may not bleed into and engage and connect with the landscape that you're a part of. And so having something that doesn't feel like it just ends at the fence line and becomes a new landscape, I think is really important. Again, whether it's exactly what's on that side or not, just trying to get some emulation between the two. And then a big thing that is starting to get more and more understood and appreciated is we have a long winter here. And so we can create these beautiful gardens that are all herbaceous, and we don't have evergreens everywhere, and they're not as structural, but they are structural, right? And there are a lot of beautiful seed heads, and the grasses stay up until we get that first nasty ice storm. And so keeping as much in the planting that can be dense and tall and stemmy, so that all winter there's some home for wildlife, so that we have something to look at, I think is another big piece to this. If we have a garden, again, that's sparse enough that it's mostly mulch and a couple plants, it's pretty sad in the winter. And if we can have more of this, it helps make it feel like something worth investing in. So in practice, what does this look like? One thing that I want to touch on, and I think Tim will touch on a different side of this, but we spend a lot of time and a lot of money fixing our soils. And we put in, I can't tell you how many other landscape architects or anyone have a little specification in their sheet about add in 12 inches of compost soils, sand in every planting, regardless of the site. It's just like, put it in, start fresh, have this good, perfect little plant bed. Great, it means that they're gonna have, good inviting conditions for the plants, but not always necessary, and sometimes harmful, because it's actually too much goodness in the soil for a lot of these plants. And so there are a lot of examples now, and these are two where people are actually planting straight into sand. People are planting straight into, in some municipal projects, they're actually crushing up, basically into sand, glass, like these recycled aggregates that are totally inert, and putting these dense perennial plantings right into them, and they thrive, and it's because they don't need all this goodness that we're giving all the time. It's not always true for trees and for shrubs and some of these woodland communities, but grasslands in general, I mean, you see on the side of the highway when you're driving up the state, little blue stem and all of these plants that we love in our meadow-style gardens, they're growing right on the edge of the highway in sand and gravel and whatever waste they put there. And so oftentimes they're happier or will be stronger and more long-lived plants if we challenge them a little bit and put some tougher conditions in there. So all that to say, it's not always necessary, and you can spend more money on plants, less money on soil, to just say, let's work with what we have. There are plants that do well in clay. There are plants that prefer sand. We don't need the good compost everywhere. And then again, that density thing. It can be any style you want. It can be in a woodland understory. It can be the grassland. But the goal is really to not have exposed ground. And this is a visual thing. I think, we're used to seeing a lot of mulch, and maybe we like mulch. I love the smell of mulch, but it's not something that we need to be doing every year. And it helps with runoff, like Jamie said. It helps with getting some protection and shelter for things that we're sharing our gardens with. So a way to think about this, how many people here have gotten some sort of landscape plan from someone in the past, or drawn something themselves to sort of lay out of that? A couple people. So, you can see this and say, okay, we've got plant next to plant next to plant. And it may seem like that's filling a bed. And then you think about that in 3D and you realize none of the ground is covered yet. So we're still not accomplishing our goal. We still have mostly mulch. We're still letting runoff happen. We're still having to weed the whole bed because there's nothing there. You could take it a step further and say this is pretty full, putting shrubs under it, and you're still mulching half of this bed, right? This is a gross exaggeration, but the point I want to make is, even if you have what looks full in 2D and you have someone give you a plan and say there's a circle touching a circle touching a circle, there's still bare ground under all of that. And so we can always go denser, and we can add in the plugs like Jamie mentioned. We can seed into these beds, but creating no exposed ground is crucial for getting water to stay in space, to go down into the soil, to keep all of these bad pollutants from washing off into roads and streams and everything else. So if someone gives you a plan with 5 circles, ask them to put 30 more circles on. You can always go denser. And so within one of these, there are a couple different styles of plants, or ways that things grow, and that's what we'll talk about a bit in the back table and elsewhere. But within these matrices is what I call them. I don't know if anyone's used that term before, but there are a couple different ways that these plants start to develop into a community. And so one of them is what I call a clumper. So these are plants that aren't necessarily self-seeding around. That's not their main way of spreading. They don't necessarily have rhizomes that are working their way through the bed, but they're really taking the crown of the plant you bought and just slowly expanding from here. And so they're an important sort of structural element in the garden, where you put a couple of them together, they create those big drifts, and they're going to mostly stay where they were when you put them in, but they're really important for that legibility across the bed. Self-seeders are equally important, so this is things like coneflower and black-eyed Susan and all of these plants that we see dotted throughout, whether it's in a more natural meadow or a plant bed. But we can emulate that in our gardens by having them appear as if they were brought in by the wind, by pollinators. So they're dotted throughout a garden randomly. It's not random, we did it, but we're trying to create the feeling of what they would want to do naturally, which is just be wherever their seed would be sent. And then underneath all of that last piece that we talked about before is how do we then fill the gaps between the spikes of self-seeders and the clumps. And this is easily done with plugs, with seed, with bare root plants. We can fill it with things that like to spread in a friendly way through our plants. So strawberry is a great one. We all have strawberry growing on our property naturally, but you can put a couple in your bed if you have them, and it will just, not slowly, pretty quickly creep its way through all your plants. And you may do a little bit of cutting them back in places if they start to climb over things, but in general, they're a great green mulch where they fill all those spaces, keep the ground from being exposed, and you get some fruit out of it, which is awesome. Or it can be grasses. You can have your spikes of color, and then you can fill the tapestry underneath it with this green weave, which again adds to that idea of legibility. So you can have all this color in pockets, but if from one side to the other you can see this coherent, consistent texture or color, it really helps people understand a space when they're looking at it. And all of this then means, okay, it's in the ground, great, but we use the term maintenance a lot, and maintenance implies maintaining, right? Keeping something in a standstill, frozen point in time, and gardens they're things that evolve always. They're not stagnant. Things are wanting to self-seed. Things want to spread. Things don't live forever. Certain plants will die. Certain plants will come in. And so we really want to play the idea of managing space as opposed to maintaining and freezing it. So if I'm putting in a new garden, it's sort of what I break it into the first season and then the rest of its life. And in the first season, if you plant densely enough, it's not going to be this constant daily, weekly weeding headache. Hopefully it's less than in a more traditional planting, but there will be weeding requirements at the beginning. You'll need to water at the beginning. We've had wet years where you need to do it less, but getting things established. And then that management idea is be the referee. So you're not saying this plant seeded over here, I need to take it out. You can decide as things evolve, what do I want to allow to happen? What do I want to step in and do something about? And some things will be necessary. Some you can just sort of let it play out, right? Let the kids play a little bit. And then beyond that, it's really becomes this as-needed idea. You may need to do some weeding, you may need to do some watering, certainly for trees and shrubs, but a lot of the perennials, if you get it established the first summer, there's no need for irrigation of these beds after. It's a different story with bigger, woodier plants, but there's a lot of unnecessary irrigation happening in these perennial gardens. And then the nice thing about perennials and all these plants is they want to keep shape-shifting. And so I like to think of a design really not starting until the plants are actually in the ground. We can design a layout and say this goes here, but then it's going to keep changing in a great way. And so then as you start to decide what you're messing with, what you're not, that's the design, is letting things keep doing this, and eventually they fit into this beautiful little community. On that note, what I want to leave people with is just a warning, I would say. Seed mixes are awesome, and they're a great, cheap way to do things, and there are a lot of great native, local eco-type seeds in Maine. That said, there are a lot of seed mixes that you find online that say Northeast Wildflower Mix, or New England Wildflower Mix. And then if you actually look at the list of plants, the majority of the plants that you actually break down and look in there are not native, are invasive, are annuals that they're putting in just to give you that pop of color at the beginning of the time before everything gets established, because we want to see something in the first year. But it's a reminder to just do your homework as you're looking on these seeds, and it's all too common. And again, there are a lot of people doing a much better job of this with truly native mixes in Maine and New England. But if you just go online and Google New England seed mix, you're going to find a lot of counterproductive stuff. So something to think hard about. And the catchphrase, I think, for all of this is it really doesn't have to be all or nothing. So, the goal is to be putting in less, trying to still get the great flower-filled garden, but putting less inputs in. It doesn't need to be 100% native per se, but we want to create these naturalistic, comforting, inspiring spaces. And along the way, if we can foster more biodiversity, create healthier soil, and create spaces that we want to spend time in, then I think that's a success. So I've got some things to share, photos and books and things, but I'll leave it at that for questions, and we can talk after, or I did.